In this episode, we're going to focus on a skill that sounds simple but often decides whether security work succeeds or fails, capturing what stakeholders expect and turning those expectations into real commitments that people follow through on. Beginners sometimes think the hard part is coming up with the right security ideas, but in real organizations, ideas only matter if people agree to act on them. Expectations are what stakeholders believe should happen, such as what level of protection is needed, how fast something must be delivered, what risks are acceptable, and what outcomes define success. If expectations are unclear, everyone assumes something different, and security work becomes a cycle of rework, frustration, and delayed decisions. If expectations are captured quickly and converted into commitments, decisions speed up, accountability improves, and security becomes part of the organization's rhythm rather than a last-minute surprise. The goal here is to show you how expectations form, how to surface them early, and how to turn them into agreed-upon actions without getting stuck in endless debate. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first thing to understand is that expectations are often unspoken until something goes wrong, which is why capturing them early is so valuable. Stakeholders might assume security will handle something automatically, or assume a system is safe because it has always worked before, or assume a project can launch without extra review. Security might assume a stakeholder understands the risk of skipping a control, or assume a team can absorb the workload of a new requirement. When assumptions collide, people feel blindsided, and the conversation turns emotional instead of productive. Capturing expectations means making those assumptions visible in plain language before they become conflict. The fastest way to do this is to focus on outcomes and constraints, not on technical details. Ask what success looks like, what failure would look like, what cannot be compromised, and what deadlines or pressures exist. When you frame the conversation this way, stakeholders can articulate expectations even if they do not know security terminology. A key concept is that stakeholder expectations usually fall into a few recurring categories: speed, cost, safety, compliance, and usability. Speed expectations involve timelines, release dates, and how quickly decisions must be made. Cost expectations involve budget limits and what investment is considered reasonable. Safety expectations involve how much risk is acceptable and what must be protected at all costs. Compliance expectations involve meeting legal obligations, customer contract requirements, and audit standards. Usability expectations involve how much friction users will tolerate and what workflows must remain smooth. These categories matter because they often conflict, and expectations can be unrealistic if they are not discussed openly. For example, a stakeholder might expect maximum security with zero friction and zero cost, which is not a real trade-off set. Capturing expectations means surfacing these categories explicitly so the organization can choose a realistic balance. The exam often tests this kind of thinking by presenting scenarios where the best answer clarifies expectations and trade-offs rather than jumping straight into a control. Capturing expectations quickly also depends on knowing who you need to hear from, because not every stakeholder expectation carries the same weight. Some stakeholders have authority to set expectations, such as leaders who own budgets and risk acceptance. Some stakeholders represent operational reality, such as technical teams who know what can be implemented in time. Some stakeholders represent obligations, such as legal or compliance teams who know what must be met. If you only talk to one group, you may capture expectations that are incomplete or impractical. The strategic skill is to get the right voices early, especially the ones whose expectations will later become blockers if they were not considered. This is where stakeholder mapping pays off, because it helps you identify who owns outcomes, who owns constraints, and who owns decisions. Fast capture does not mean talking to everyone. It means talking to the right people with targeted questions. When you do that, you reduce surprises later, which saves far more time than it costs up front. Once expectations are captured, the next step is turning them into commitments, and that requires clarity about what a commitment actually is. An expectation is a belief about what should happen, but a commitment is an agreement that someone will do something or accept something. Commitments have owners, timelines, and criteria for completion. They also require mutual understanding, because one side's idea of done might not match the other side's. For example, a stakeholder may expect improved security, but what does improved mean, and how will it be recognized? A commitment might be that a team will implement a specific guardrail by a certain date, or that leadership will fund a specific initiative, or that a risk will be accepted explicitly with documented rationale. The act of making a commitment forces ambiguity to shrink, because people must agree on what action is being taken. In strategic security, turning expectations into commitments is how you move from conversation to execution. A common beginner mistake is assuming that agreement is automatic if everyone nods in a meeting, but nodding is not commitment. People nod for many reasons, including politeness, confusion, or temporary agreement that dissolves under pressure. Converting expectations into commitments requires making the agreement explicit in a way that is hard to misunderstand. That can be as simple as restating the decision in plain language, assigning ownership, and confirming the timeline. It also involves making sure the commitment fits the stakeholders' incentives and constraints, because people cannot commit to what they cannot realistically deliver. If a team is overloaded, a commitment that requires major work in a short time may fail, which harms trust. A strategic approach looks for a commitment that is achievable, even if it is phased, and pairs it with a clear explanation of why it matters. The exam often rewards answers that emphasize clarity and feasibility because they reflect how real commitments are sustained. Another important concept is that commitments can be about doing something, but they can also be about accepting something. Sometimes the best strategic outcome is not immediate remediation, but explicit risk acceptance, especially when the cost or disruption of fixing something is too high relative to the benefit. In those cases, converting expectations into commitments means clarifying who has the authority to accept the risk and ensuring they understand the business impact. Risk acceptance is not avoidance of responsibility. It is a choice that leadership makes within risk appetite. The commitment is that the organization is knowingly accepting the exposure, often with a plan to revisit later or with compensating controls. Beginners sometimes think the only acceptable outcome is to fix everything, but strategy involves choosing where to spend limited resources. The exam often tests whether you understand that explicit decisions are better than implicit drift, and turning expectations into commitments is how you create explicit decisions. Capturing expectations quickly also means learning to listen for hidden expectations, which often show up as emotion, urgency, or vague objections. If someone says this will slow us down, the hidden expectation might be that speed is a top priority and security must not add friction. If someone says we cannot afford this, the hidden expectation might be that budgets are tight and security must justify value clearly. If someone says this could get us sued, the hidden expectation might be that legal exposure is unacceptable and compliance must be prioritized. These signals are valuable because they reveal what is truly driving the stakeholders' thinking. A strategic conversation does not fight these signals. It uses them to clarify the real expectation and to shape a commitment that respects it. When you can translate emotion into a clear expectation, you reduce conflict because you are addressing the underlying concern rather than arguing about surface details. This is a major skill in security leadership, even for beginners learning the concepts. To convert expectations into commitments, it also helps to define boundaries, meaning what is in scope and what is out of scope for the decision. Scope clarity prevents the common trap where a discussion expands until it becomes unmanageable. For example, a conversation about improving access control can suddenly turn into a conversation about redesigning the entire system, which delays progress and prevents commitment. Strategic progress often comes from defining a first step that is meaningful and achievable, then committing to that step while acknowledging longer-term work. This is not settling for less. It is building momentum and trust. When stakeholders see follow-through on a smaller commitment, they become more willing to commit to larger changes later. The exam often tests whether you can choose an approach that produces progress rather than endless planning, and scope discipline is a big part of that. Commitments also need a way to handle disagreements without stalling. because stakeholders will not always align easily. When there is disagreement, the strategic move is to separate facts, assumptions, and preferences. Facts include things like contractual obligations, known impact of outages, and documented incidents. Assumptions include beliefs about likelihood, effort, and timing. Preferences include comfort levels and risk tolerance. When you separate these, you can resolve disagreements more efficiently because you can challenge assumptions with evidence and negotiate preferences within risk appetite. This approach also helps you avoid personal conflict because you are discussing ideas rather than attacking people. If a stakeholder wants to move fast and another wants more assurance, you can clarify what minimum guardrails satisfy both, or what compensating controls can balance speed and safety. The commitment then becomes a negotiated trade-off rather than a forced compromise that no one supports. This kind of reasoning is often what the exam is trying to measure in strategic scenario questions. A practical idea that supports commitments is making them visible, because what is visible is harder to ignore. Visibility does not require special tools. It requires that decisions are recorded clearly enough that people can refer back to them. When commitments are not visible, they can be forgotten, reinterpreted, or denied later, which creates churn. When commitments are visible, they become part of the organization's shared reality, and accountability becomes easier. Visibility also reduces the temptation to reopen settled decisions every time someone new enters the conversation. Beginners sometimes underestimate how much time is wasted by relitigating decisions, and turning expectations into visible commitments is one of the best ways to reduce that waste. The exam may not ask about documentation directly, but it often rewards answers that emphasize clarity, accountability, and repeatability, which are all supported by visible commitments. It is also important to recognize that commitments should be revisited when conditions change, because strategy is not static. A commitment made under one set of constraints might need adjustment if the business changes direction, a new threat emerges, or a major incident occurs. Revisiting is not failure, it is responsible governance. The key is that revisiting should be intentional and based on new information, not based on random discomfort or second-guessing. When stakeholders understand that commitments can be reviewed on a schedule or when triggers occur, they are more willing to commit now, because they know the decision is not permanent if the world changes. This is especially relevant for security, where threat environments and business priorities can shift. Strategic security creates commitments that are strong but adaptable, and that balance is what keeps the program moving without becoming brittle. To close, capturing stakeholder expectations quickly and converting them into commitments is the skill that transforms security strategy from talk into action. You surface expectations early by focusing on outcomes and constraints, and you recognize that expectations often cluster around speed, cost, safety, compliance, and usability. You involve the right stakeholders, not everyone, and you translate unspoken signals into clear statements of what people need. You then convert expectations into commitments by making agreements explicit, assigning ownership, defining timelines, and clarifying what done means. You handle disagreements by separating facts, assumptions, and preferences, and you manage scope so progress is achievable. You make commitments visible so accountability is real, and you revisit them intentionally when conditions change. When you can do these things, security decisions stop drifting and start landing. And that ability to create durable commitments is a major part of what the GST-RT exam is designed to assess.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.